Halloween Kills is the latest addition into the long-running Halloween franchise, the second entry in this newly revived trilogy, and like we do on this channel, whenever there is a new release in a franchise, we rank all the entries from worst to best, and there is 12 in this franchise. Feel free to join me in commenting down below what your ranking is, and without further ado, let's get into it. Coming in at 12th and last place is Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. If you follow this franchise, you'll know that this is a really strange entry into this franchise because it's the only film that doesn't have the icon of this franchise, Michael Myers. It attempts to take the franchise down a different direction by just telling individual stories that happen on Halloween. I have a little respect for it for trying to experiment, but it just doesn't work. It's not to say the lack of Michael Myers is the problem, or that trying something new and taking it in a different direction is the problem. It's just the way they do it. They could have had a really good story, but the one they brought in is really underwhelming and quite silly, especially after the two good entries in this franchise. As I mentioned, I can respect it for trying to do something different, but it fails to conjure up a good plot to justify it because it's absolutely ridiculous. And also one thing which really irritated me about that film is it revolves around this advert, and whenever that advert plays, it has a, I wouldn't say catchy song, but a very irritating one which gets stuck in your head. So who knows, maybe an anthology Halloween series would have been successful if they kept continuing and eventually came up with a good movie, but this is the dark horse of the franchise, as it's one which is not actually in the universe, as in that film it shows someone watching John Carpenter's Halloween. So very odd one and not a good movie at all, hence why it's in last place. Coming in at 11th place is Halloween 5 The Revenge of Michael Myers. This fifth film, of course, following on from Halloween 4, which ended with a good twist ending which would obviously follow into this film, but right from the beginning this film is doomed, as it literally cuts away that ending, well, it adapts it into something completely different, which is really odd. It doesn't work. It tries to adapt a psychological connection between Jamie and Michael Myers, but with the way it's executed and portrayed on screen, it comes off really messy and you're not sure if something's real or not, and that's not the intention. It's not like an acid trip. It's just really awkward, poorly executed. Not taking anything away from Donald Pleasance's performance, because he's always going to be good in this role, but the character of Dr. Loomis was quite irritating on screen. He didn't shut up. Obviously he's going crazy, but it was portrayed way too over the top. He would never shut up, and he'd always shout at Jamie, which just got really repetitive. Took away a bit of respect for his character, but as this is a sequel which isn't well regarded, don't hold on to the character too much overall. Overall, the execution is just poor. It has some of the franchise's worst moments, and not to mention it even lacks any kind of satisfying or gory kills. Coming in at 10th place is Halloween 2 2009. The fact that Rob Zombie didn't have any plans to make a sequel and was quite heavily against it, obviously being persuaded in the end, tells the story of this film. It is an utter mess. Besides perhaps Michael Myers, who is one of the scariest Michael Myers we've had in this franchise. He's more animated, he's bigger, he's stronger, he's more violent. But besides him, none of the characters are really that likable or enjoyable on screen, especially when our two main characters besides Michael, Loomis and Laurie, are unbearable on screen. So it makes it really hard to latch on to anybody when the only person you can latch onto is the one who's brutally murdering people. Like its predecessor, which we'll talk about later on, Rob Zombie's Halloween 2 is unnecessarily sexual at points where it just becomes frustrating because there's literally no need for it. It's as if the script was written by an immature teenager. However, that doesn't stand out as one of the worst things compared to other stuff in this film, as the plot is just terrible. And it's constantly featuring visions of Rob Zombie's wife, which is of course meant to be Michael Myers' mum, but it's really odd, and there's nothing really that I could enjoy about it. Felt quite miserable watching it, other than some kills that Michael Myers executed. But if you can't make your main characters likable, then it's never gonna really be a successful film, and it felt like they were trying to make these characters as unlikable as possible. Coming in at 9th place is Halloween Resurrection. This film dooms itself from the start. by doing the most unforgivable of movie sins. Spoiler warning for this film, that sin is killing off Laurie Strode, played by Jamie Lee Curtis, in the opening, which just felt completely unnecessary, as what follows on from that is just a completely different direction, different tone, and it's not one which is good. That plot feels quite outdated and is certainly something which was popular at the time, where it turns the Halloween franchise into Big Brother-esque game show with over-the-top characters, more over-the-top than the ones we're used to in this franchise. It's common for horror franchises to stem into ridiculous and campiness. However, they always offer something, whether that's, entertainment, good kills, something fun. But Halloween Resurrection doesn't do any of them. It just feels like it strays way too far from its original source material. I think John Carpenter would be disgraced of what his original film has led to. And it draws in a side plot which feels so unnecessary and doesn't really accomplish anything, which just feels like it was added to make the film reach 90 minutes long. So after what was returned to form in the previous entry, Halloween Resurrection once again sinks the ship. Coming in at 8th place is Halloween: The Curse of Michael Myers. Just to clarify, I watched the producer's cut, which is supposedly, according to Dead Meat, quite a bit better than the theatrical release, and I can understand why people would have this in last place, and I'd understand if you're having a go at me in the comments for this. This is by far the weirdest the franchise has gone, by bringing in a cult and straying way too far from what we expect, and it doesn't really work, I'll be honest, and I am aware of that. Overall, it's just a very messy film, but where this film is higher than it would probably be on other people's lists is it's a unique film. Now, that's not to say it's good. It has a very bizarre plot, and that made me intrigued as to see where it would go. This is one which sticks out in the franchise despite it not being good. It's a switch up from the classic generic Halloween film. And as you can see by my score, this isn't me necessarily praising it, just justifying the reason why I prefer this to those other ones. Another reason why I may be so intrigued in it is that it features one of the first acting roles for my favourite actor, Paul Rudd, where he is quite strange and he's not the Paul Rudd we know today. Just seeing a young him in something like this was enjoyable for me to grab my attention, so perhaps that boosted my score by a bit. But look, this is a bad film, and I completely understand those who have it in last place. I'm not saying it's at all good by having it not in last place. I'm just saying it was refreshing to see something new despite it being very bad. Coming in at 7th place is Halloween 4: The Return of Michael Myers. Following on from Season of the Witch, Halloween 4 lives up to its title by bringing back Michael Myers and just brings back yet another generic slasher film, which was probably what was needed at the time. However, overall, it's just boring, There's nothing really thrilling about it other than a really good performance from kid actor Danielle Harris, who made Jamie Lloyd a compelling character. Halloween 4 doesn't commit any horrible acts. It doesn't, do something which immediately sinks it. It's just overall really underwhelming. It's just, the story is dull, the kills aren't anything special, it has goofiness, it's just instantly forgettable. As mentioned, none of the kills are memorable, I can't recall a kill from that film, so it doesn't commit any awful sins, it's bland and familiar. Coming in at 6th place is Rob Zombie's Halloween. This is the director's cut, just like Rob Zombie's Halloween 2 was. And to be honest, this is just a pointless remake, as it copies the original beat by beat after establishing an awkward first half of the film which showed Michael's backstory, which I didn't feel like I really needed. Of course, this is a remake, so it's a completely different universe, but seeing Michael's backstory, seeing him properly talking, besides when he was a kid in the opening of the original, it kind of takes away the mysterious aspects of the character, and don't find him as intimidating despite Michael Myers himself being more brutal, big and strong here. I touched upon the sexual content in Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. It wasn't as bad there, but here it's just unbelievable. It's overwhelming the amount of sexual implications, whether that's in conversation, threats, or even really disturbing scenes which happens in the director's cut, where it's a really graphic rape scene which is hard to watch, and immediately that knocks off a lot of points for what I scored this film. Not only does it feel like a dumb way to allow Michael to escape from his mental institution, but it just feels like it's so unnecessary. Like, as we see in the theatrical cut, there's a much better way for him to escape, but here it's Rob Zombie being sexual as always, but it's really uncomfortable and unnecessary as well. Overall, Halloween 1978 is a perfect horror film, which we'll talk about in a bit. So a remake feels very unnecessary and it doesn't add anything to it. Overall, it's just a huge money grab with uncomfortable scenes, and not uncomfortable in the good way. Coming in at 5th place is Halloween H2O. Following the wackiness of the Halloween sequels, which we talked about earlier on in this video, which were way back there, this film is somewhat a return to form as it ignores all those sequels, returns to a really basic premise, and not to mention brings back Jamie Lee Curtis as Laurie Strode. To return to basics with a different enough environment, but it is still far from the original's quality. It has a few memorable moments, but overall characters are quite dull and forgettable. Jamie Lee Curtis does the best with what she can do, but there isn't too much which sticks out amongst this franchise. Just nice to see her return, as well as this franchise return to its more grounded roots. It may have some recognizable faces in the cast, but overall the story does let it down. Coming in at 4th place is the newly released Halloween Kills. This film does what its title suggests. It racks up a huge kill count, and they're not quiet about it. They're perhaps some of the darkest kills in this entire franchise, so if that's what you enjoy out of these films, you'll enjoy that aspect of this one. I really liked and appreciated that it attempted to tell a new story where, in this case, Haddonfield is hunting Michael Myers, not the other way around. So it actually makes this feel more like a town than just Michael Myers coming for his annual slasher fest in each film. They're actually fighting back in this occasion instead of just letting Michael Myers do his annual work. But where that was a good idea, the execution is well below par from what the writers had imagined. And one of the main issues that comes down to is the lack of building the tension that the previous entry had done. They just expect the viewer to be fully engaged following that film's success. However, I just didn't feel it. Whilst being heavily connected to Halloween 1978, which it had some really good ties to, it has flashbacks which looked real. It gets convoluted at times and hard to follow, especially when it brings back old characters where the actors aren't that recognizable. And where it has those flashbacks, it kind of takes the spotlight away from Laurie Strode, Jamie Lee Curtis, who's not actually in this film a lot, which is understandable as, you know, she's in the hospital, which provoked familiar feelings from Halloween 2, which we'll talk about soon. It was a shame because the film seemed to lack a real vocal character, despite Michael Myers, of course, with Jamie Lee Curtis sidelined for the whole duration. There are points where this film feels like it's leading towards a conclusion to the Michael Myers character, which would have been somewhat satisfying with if it was executed properly. But if you follow this franchise, you'll know, following on from Halloween 2018's success, they announced there'll be Halloween Kills and Halloween Ends, so you kind of don't feel the stakes, you don't feel as engaged, as this is just another stepping stone towards the climax. So it is a bridge film and it certainly does give off that aspect, but it does deliver some really dark and gory kills along the way. But it could have been so much better if the writing was a bit better, but it just let itself down in the end. Coming in at 3rd place is Halloween 2 1981. I think this film gets more hate than it deserves. I think it's a really good follow-up. You rarely get a horror classic which has a good sequel, let alone at its same quality, so I think this is a fine entry. It's quite good, not gonna match the first's quality, but it's a solid overlapping continuation of the character. I think is what spawned the rest of the sequels. Now, that's not me saying it's a better film than the original, because if you're paying attention, it's obviously lower than it. But as this film carried on the characters, that opened up for more opportunities to explore in other films rather than Halloween just being a one-off. It expands Michael Myers' haunting presence to show him more indestructible. Despite its larger budget, the kills actually somehow feel weaker than its predecessor. It does have some good kills, but maybe it's down to the execution of the overall film's quality of Halloween 1978, which is why they're better, because they hit more. These ones may just feel like a bit of, fodder, but they didn't have the same feeling and the same good execution about them, but nonetheless entertaining, just not too memorable. Overall, the sequel fails to live up to its predecessor, but when does it ever live up to its predecessor? Coming in at second place is Halloween 2018, this being the third movie in this 12-movie franchise to be called Halloween, and it's not even a reboot. Halloween is a follow-up to Halloween. It ignores all the sequels, including the fairly good Halloween 2 from 1981, and it gives us a simple, reasonable continuation of Laurie Strode and Michael Myers without all the bizarre things that happen in between. It is instantly clear that this isn't a cash grab at bringing back a beloved franchise. It clearly intends to try and match the quality of the original by having some absolutely beautiful cinematography, including smartly captured long takes, which just show how brutal Michael Myers can be. Maybe a shock to people, but my favourite thing about this film is actually the score. John Carpenter returns and provides his classic theme whilst updating it to feel more appropriate to this modern film, and not to mention just absolutely chilling things which do occur throughout the duration, which just hit different thanks to this score that he's established. I don't usually talk about scores in films as they normally occur in really good films, and I tend to cover about a lot of things and then I get round to talking about the score, but here, this is a good film, don't take anything away from it, but it's very rare that you get such a fantastic score in a horror film, especially these days, and I think John Carpenter's theme stands above his original from Halloween, which we'll talk about soon. Jamie Lee Curtis's return proves to be very captivating, as there is a lot of history between her and Michael Myers, and the viewer is constantly reminded about it with some callbacks to iconic shots, moments from the original, but kind of reversed in a way. What unfortunately holds this sequel back, as many would agree, is one of the plot twists which happens with Dr. Sartain. It just feels silly and unbelievable for what was quite a grounded film, or quite a serious one, so it was a shame that ruined a bit of it. I feel like fans of this franchise can appreciate this film for being, which is going to be a bold statement from me, but the best entry in this franchise since the film, which we'll talk about in number one spot. If you haven't guessed what that is already, here you go. You already knew what film it was going to be before clicking on this video. Coming in at first place is Halloween 1978, the original, the one to start off this franchise. And like you'll find in most cases, the original is the best. When someone mentions the slasher subgenre, my mind instantly gravitates towards this film. It revolutionized it. You may look at it now and be like, oh, there's quite a few cliches in there, quite a few horror cliches or horror tropes. You have to take into account 1978. This film pretty much, and in some cases, developed those horror cliches to change the genre that we know today. John Carpenter absolutely nails many things about this film, just the film overall, but one being Michael Myers, the iconic villain, who's made to be extremely terrifying without having to say a single word. It really makes him feel like this unnatural presence and make him feel like he doesn't have a soul, which, well, the sequels explore a bit more, but I don't think this film was intending to set up those sequels. So this film makes Michael Myers one of the best horror villains, if not the best. Bold statement from me. As talked about, it has been surpassed in my opinion, but John Carpenter nailed this score for this film, which is so iconic to this day. It's such an uncomfortable key at a really quick pace, which made me quite unsettled, especially whenever The tension was building, it made me feel vulnerable in some senses. I just think it perfectly captures the tone for one of the greatest horror films of all time, and for me, the greatest slasher film of all time from what I've seen so far. That may change, because I had this rating a lot lower before rewatching this, and I can fully appreciate the film's overall quality now that I have rewatched it with more critique knowledge. So that was my ranking for all 12 Halloween films. This ranking will be updated next year with the 13th film, Halloween Ends, which looks to end the franchise for good for the time being, which I'm sure in maybe 10 years time they'll look to pick up in some kind of way, perhaps another reboot titled Halloween. It might try to be original. But anyways, yeah, as I mentioned, let me know what your ranking is down below. With lists this big, it's really interesting to see what other people think. I'll have a feeling that the Paul Rudd movie will probably be last place for many, and hey, even my last place might be controversial considering that film's become somewhat of a cult classic. Obviously nowhere near people's top 3, I'd imagine, but it's getting more praise nowadays as it's something different. But anyways, please like and subscribe, it would really mean a lot. The subscribers and views have been picking up massively recently, so I thank you for that. That may be helped by October's big releases, but nonetheless, I appreciate every view. And anyways, I hope to see you in my next video. Take care, and I'll see you soon.